Sunday update. EDEL 308, reading and writing, diagnostics, and remediation. Whew! These Sunday morning ones, I look slobby with a hoodie. I can't speak clearly yet, but I learned some neat things about reading. So we defined reading for the purposes of this course as a process of making meaning with background knowledge and text information. So a few points to that definition. The first is making meaning versus getting meaning. One view of reading would be that you look at a text and it gives you reading or meaning. You get meaning from the text. And then another view is that you make meaning through the text. And we are looking at reading as a process of making meaning, not getting reading. We also look at it as a process instead of a skill. The process, it's more complete, it's interrelated, it's largely internal and you can't necessarily see it, whereas a skill would be a behavior that you could observe. Third part is that you use background knowledge, and this is a large part cultural, and not only like ethnicity cultural, could be just as simple as your personality, what your interests are, urban, rural, those kind of pieces. But you always do bring your background knowledge into reading. And then text information. You can define text information as wide as like anything that you can look at and get information from, including photos and videos and all of those things. And that's a good definition. For the purpose of our course, we're looking at print cues. So literal written words that are texts. But you could broaden the definition, but for the purpose of this course, we're looking at reading words. And there are pictures or other text features within these, but that's what we're looking at, is reading of words. And reading is also situational, so you read differently depending on where you are, depending on what the purpose is, and that's recognized as well. We also touched on our definition of writing, which is very similar, a process of process of constructing and evoking meaning through the use of background knowledge and text creation. So again, it's a process, and there's ongoing meaning making. As you write, often you make more meaning. And the idea of evoking meaning rather than conveying meaning. It's another observation from Rosenblatt, social constructivist, that you're evoking meaning. You're not just conveying meaning by creating a text. And again, we're talking about words being written. So the main topic of today was, how do we assess reading? So one option, there's three: standardized testing, observing the reader, and informal reading inventory. So standardized tests, these are where procedures are standardized. They're often made by companies, they're produced, they're often expensive because they need to field test them to make sure that they're valid. Some positives are that they're consistent, they're reliable. You can see what typical answers are for age ranges, and you can make comparisons quite easily. Some negatives are that they often lack authenticity. In other words, this is ecological validity. So if I'm sitting at a desk with a teacher reading a thing that the teacher chose, that's not actually very similar to the experience of reading. And so that's a big criticism, that it doesn't compare to real reading. Another is that the examiner can't examine the responses. They're not able to dig deeper and differentiate that test because it's standardized. And they usually focus in a bottom-up way of looking at reading. So your accuracy, your decoding of words, and getting meaning from text rather than making meaning. So that's kind of one end of the spectrum. And the other end would be observing the reader in their natural reading environment. Many theorists would argue that this is the only authentic way of assessing reading, because you're actually observing the reader in their reading environment. But there's some huge negatives. Time is a huge one for the classroom. Which context? So a student reading in the classroom is already inauthentic compared to them reading at home. And so that's a big issue. There's some studies that show that students' reading behaviors are much different in the classroom or at home, and I think that totally makes sense. I think back again to the underground reader that reads a lot at home but doesn't care about reading at school. And you can only observe so much. At some point, you kind of have to ask a question. You have to have the student verbalize their understanding, because you can only glean so much from straight observing. And it's hard to find points of comparison and record evidence. If you've taught for 20 years, then yeah, maybe you can compare, but straight observing is pretty tricky. So, in the 1940s, informal reading inventories were produced as a compromise between standardized tests, which were too dry and inauthentic, and observing reading, which was too inconsistent and unreliable. So I believe that Fontes and Pinnell, which we use, is an informal reading informal reading inventory. These are interviews, informal tests. And so we started diving a little bit into IRIs, and these are really exciting to me because I actually already do my own version of these daily, and I really enjoy them. And so these are, the goal again was to kind of approximate real with enough structure that teachers can use. They can be teacher made, which is exciting. So during this, I was thinking about just using some of these books to make my own informal reading inventories. And I think that I already do that when the kids bring whatever they're reading to me and I just read it with them and kind of take notes and ask questions. I think I can be even more authentic if I go to them where their reading space is in the classroom. So they usually start with a word list to approximate the entry point. Not always. Alberta Ed's version did not start with a word list because Alberta Ed did not want teachers to use the word list as their student reading level rather than the actual informal reading inventory. So Alberta Ed didn't trust teachers in a way to use the thing for what it was made for. Often there's graded passage that are at an escalated level of difficulty. So for F and P, we have A to Z. And they're also split, usually narrative and expository. A big question when you're looking at which of these IRIs you want to use is how many forms there are, how many passages at each level, which I find interesting because the F&P that we currently have only has one passage at each level for narrative and one passage at each level for expository. I think that they have a whole new run, so maybe we could get 2 levels at each passage, but even that doesn't seem like enough. The authenticity depends on the reader, and like I said, reading where the kids are might be an interesting one. The comprehension questions often have a mix of some literal bottom-up questions, some more opinion critical, what would happen if top-down questions, and some inferential, interpretive, kind of higher level questions. Why did this person do this? What kind of character is this person? Those kind of questions. And I see that in F&P as well, and I'm sure I'll see that in the batter, which I'm excited to look into. And then there's some procedures for administration and procedures for diagnostic analysis, so steps that you take when you administer these tests. There are some criticisms of informal reading inventory, although they are our chosen method in this course. There are some valid criticisms. The biggest of which being is, are they the best of both worlds or are they the worst of both worlds? Top-down people would say these are too artificial. It's a test. You're not getting any valid information anyways. Whereas bottom-up people would say there's too much teacher subjectivity. Because you allow teacher judgment, it's not valid. So you could be attacked on both sides. What was really keyed in on was that it is important to consider the results in context with all of your other professional judgment, which I found right on point. I feel this a lot. I love using F&P as one assessment for my students, but when that becomes the only measure of what their reading level is, that's when there's a problem. And so I believe in teacher judgment personally, and I really think that these IRIs can be powerful tools as part of the full teaching pack. So my next step is to read through the batter So I have the textbook coming on Amazon. It should be here tomorrow. Read through it and kind of see what that assessment's all about. And I look forward to trying a different IRI this year with some of my students.